That was from the trailer of Pet Sematary, the latest incarnation of Stephen King's classic tale. I'm going to read the plot summary of Pet Sematary online. Dr. Lewis Creed and his wife Rachel relocate from Boston to rural Maine with their 2 young children. The couple soon discover a mysterious burial ground hidden deep in the woods near their home. When tragedy strikes, Lewis turns to his neighbor, Judd Crandall, setting off a perilous chain reaction that unleashes an unspeakable evil with horrific consequences. What a nice little summary there.
Yeah.
Joining us today on the Slash Filmcast to review Pet Sematary, she is a writer whose work has appeared at Fangoria, Birth Movies Death, and Rue Morgue. Ariel Fisher, welcome to the Slash Filmcast. Ariel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you on. Now, I discovered Ariel's work a couple months ago when she published a piece at Birth Movies Death entitled, "Obviously, The Last Jedi's throne room fight scene is about online dating," which is about the Last Jedi and that big throne room fight scene with all the red curtains and all the Praetorian guards and everything. Apparently, it's about online dating, which I didn't recognize that at the time that I saw it, but it's been true all along. Ariel, do you mind summarizing the main gist of this article in like a few sentences?
Well, basically what happened was everybody was celebrating the 1-year anniversary, and I rewatched that scene, and I'm going, damn, this is really hot. And then you start thinking about everything that they go through in the film. And it's basically a whole lot of back and forth, kind of some gaslighting stuff's going on. Kylo Ren's trying to kind of backhanded compliment her into submission.
Here's my pics, basically. Like, look at me.
Exactly.
It's great.
Exactly. Nudes are GTFO. But, it just kind of spirals out of control until eventually they meet up and, they have this whole date that's basically the throne room fight scene. And there's some outperformance of one another, and it's this.
Yeah, it's the climax of the relationship. Yeah, I get it.
Very literally, in more ways than one.
All right. Well, people can check that out at Birth Movies Death, and I'll link to it in the show notes. But Ariel, it's great to have you on today. And Pet Sematary. This is a movie that is I guess it's a remake, right, of the Stephen King story.
Pretty much.
And of course, like the original 1989 film is a movie that has been in many people's past. Devindra, it sounds like you've seen the original Pet Sematary, directed by Mary Lambert. And
is it Lambert or Lambert? I'm not sure.
One of those, yes.
One of those.
Lambert.
Right.
And
Perfect.
Ariel, you've seen that film as well, right? So, like, I guess before we dive into this new Pet Sematary, like, what is the place of that Pet Sematary in your mind? Like, is it something you revere? Is it something you're a fan of? Or is it like kind of a subpar one of these Stephen King films? What do you think?
Well, I mean, honestly, I'm probably going to piss a bunch of people off, but I mean, I like it a lot. There's parts of it that I love, and there's a lot that I really dislike about it. It's pretty cheesy. I think the actual death scene in the film is surprisingly emotional. It always makes me cry, which is, again, I say surprising because anyone who's seen it before knows it's pretty melodramatic. But and that's, I think, putting it a little lightly. But in terms of King adaptations, all apologies to Miss Lambert. I don't think it's one of the best. And I think it fails in some of the ways that this new one fails, which obviously we'll get into. But it definitely holds a very specific place.
Mid to lower tier King adaptation, in your opinion?
Yeah, and we have Fred Gwynne, who's basically the only human being who will ever be allowed to play Judd Crandall. So, he ruined that for everyone.
How about you, Devindra? Any thoughts on the original?
This is a movie. I'm surprised that, Dave, you haven't seen it.
I have not.
And Ariel, you've only seen it recently, right? I grew up with this movie. And maybe that's just weird. And maybe, like, I don't know, that says something about, like, the lax movie restriction policies in my household. But I remember seeing this movie when I was, like, 6 or 7 with my parents at home. It was probably on HBO or something. And I haven't really thought about this movie much since then, and certainly since the 90s. And I just rewatched it this week, and it struck me like how indelible so much of the imagery from this movie is, at least. Like, it's certainly not a perfect movie. It's a bit hokey. It's a bit corny. There's some ghost stuff that I think is just played a little too much. And I'm not a fan of the lead either, like the father, the actor who plays the father. But I think Mary Lambert's imagery is tremendous. Like there's some sequences that seeing them now made me as afraid as I was, when I was like a kid seeing this particular image or something for the first time. And there's some stuff I'm going to bring up in spoilers. But it's just so many of those things. Like, there are bits of this movie that just feel iconic to me, maybe because of when I saw it, but also because it feels different than most horror movies and certainly most Stephen King movies. But yeah, we'll get into that down the line. I just have to say, like, this movie, I guess it's something I distinctly remember, and that is certainly a part of like how I went into this new one.
Yeah. So I want to say that I have not seen the original Pet Sematary, but I have seen the series that Dale Midkiff starred in the early 1990s called Time Tracks. Did you guys ever see that movie?
Of
that
course.
Show, Time Tracks?
Yeah.
I did not.
So I'm going to read the plot summary for Time Tracks. In the year 2193, over 100 criminals become fugitives of law enforcement by traveling back in time 200 years using a time machine called Tracks. Darian Lambert, played by Dale Midkiff, is a police detective of that period who is sent back to 1993 to apprehend as many fugitives as possible. He's assisted by the Specified Encapsulated Limitless Memory Archive, or SELMA, an extremely small but powerful computer disguised for the mission as a credit card. Anyway,
and 90s sci-fi shows were amazing.
Yeah, that show
they
was
really
awesome.
Tried hard.
That show was awesome. So,
I remember it. Yeah.
I have seen many hours of Dale Midkiff on television, but unfortunately none of it was in the Pet Sematary film. Instead, definitely Time Tracks was more my jam back then. But in any case, let's fast forward to the present day. Let's time travel, as it were, to the present day and talk about the new Pet Sematary. So, Ariel, you said kind of like, let me do that again. So, Ariel, you said kind of that these two Pet Semataries had similar failures, but overall, what were your thoughts on the new film?
Overall, I feel like the new film it's a solid effort. I think they try to do something really unique and very different with the tone of the film. They tried to make it look a little bit darker, and that's actually, unfortunately, my screening of it was a little tarnished. Thanks, Cineplex, Young and Eglinton in Toronto. You ruined it for me a bit. It was overly dark, so apparently there's bits and pieces of it that I didn't actually see fully. I'm hearing about this like an hour ago, so clearly there was nothing I could do about it. But I think it's a solid effort. I think they tried to wink at the audience a little bit who might be familiar with the original film, which was really cute. They made it's hard to do it without, I know we're going to save a lot for the spoiler section, but ultimately, I think it fails the same way the original fails, which is the same way a lot of King adaptations fail in general, which is trying too hard to make it adhere to very strict horror tropes instead of recognizing that the predominant horror themes are actually just surrounding, for instance, in this case, death itself. King's horror usually encompasses very human horrors, very human problems and concerns. He's, a blue-collar writer. He was a blue-collar writer when he wrote Carrie and from the time he started, and he still is. And a lot of that comes down to the human experience and the things that horrify us about that. And I think this film, like its predecessor and many others that are adaptations of King's work, hinge a little too much on the spookables and don't have enough faith in themselves to adhere tonally to the source material. And I think this film, like many others, commits that sin, as opposed to something like any of the adaptations by Frank Darabont, for instance, that are tonal perfection, and even some of which were done so well that King said to him, I wish I'd thought of that, right? I mean, ultimately, the goal of an adaptation isn't necessarily to mimic word for word, but rather just to take the source material and bring it to life. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a direct copy.
So I think is your issue with this film that it kind of adheres too closely to the original text to its detriment as a film? Is that what you're saying? Or?
No, it adheres. Well, I guess you kind of have to. Devendra said it before. You can't really consider this film without considering its predecessor, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
It's weirdly more of a remake of that film than it is an adaptation of the book, it feels like.
Exactly. Exactly. Like they did different things with it that take other material from the book that Mary Lambert's film didn't. But they also make changes to the book that aren't necessarily benefiting the story in the long run. They adhere too close to certain specific items in the book while not trying to tonally bring it to life, I think is the problem.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in the spoilers. Devindra, overall thoughts on the new Pet Sematary?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think you're right, Ariel. Like, this feels like a solid effort, except there's just a lot holding it back from being, very good or even great. And my heart, I think, is always going to be with that first movie just because of how I saw it and when I saw it. And it was kind of a formative thing for me. And honestly, because of that, watching this movie at certain points kind of made me angry because it did feel like they were winking a little too much. Like at certain points, when you're expecting like a certain stab or something to happen, the camera angle will be exactly the same way it was in the first movie. And they're just going to veer in the other direction, do something different. But they did it so many times that it felt like I didn't know who they were making this movie for. Like, were they making it for people who liked the other movie and just wanted to be surprised that they took the story in another direction? I'm not quite sure. And, the story is always, the heart of the story is about the horror of what happens when a parent loses a child and how that destroys a family and can drive you insane. And I think that's inherently terrifying. Honestly, I was a little scared to get into this movie now that I have a baby, and it's just the concept of that. It just feels mind-numbing and insane to me. So yeah, I think certain aspects of this movie work. It's definitely moody. I like Jason Clarke more than I like what's his face, the other guy,
Dale Midkiff.
Dale Midkiff. Time tracks. I really like John Lithgow in this movie, even though he is no Fred Gwynn. The sort of like hard knock Lifetime Maynor type thing. Like he kind of gets that down pretty good. And I think the sense of like place in the wildness and weirdness of the woods is well done here too. It just didn't feel like this movie went far enough or did anything super inventive. It kind of hinges on one big twist that deviates from the original film and maybe the book. I haven't read the book. But I think by hinging on that too, it feels like they're leaning too much into it rather than just like trying to tell us a scary story, doing something more interesting or nuanced with this concept.
Yeah. So I have zero context for anything you two are talking about in terms of the original book. I literally didn't even know what the plot of the book was going into this movie. Yeah, and I was tried to stay away from it, and I'm like,
so all your life, Dave, you were just like, why are they spelling cemetery wrong? These people are just.
That's right. That's me. I ask that question every single time. I'm one of those people on Twitter that tweeted at like Fandango and was like, "What? Why cemetery? Hey, this is really embarrassing, Fandango, but you spelled cemetery wrong." No, I knew about the cemetery misspelling, but I didn't know anything about the plot of the film. So I went in completely fresh, and I would say that overall I didn't like this movie very much. I think there are, if I could say two things about the movie that I didn't really like. One of them is that we've talked about this before on the Slash Filmcast about how we like horror movies where the characters in the movie are smarter than the audience, right? Like are smarter.
Don't move towards the noise, people. Slowly.
Yeah, they're smarter than you are, right? Like if imagine yourself in that situation and you're thinking to yourself, what would I do in that situation?
Right.
And the character does something even smarter than that, and you're like, oh man, like I wish I thought of that. Like that's so cool that the character thought of that. In this,
by the
movie,
way, shout out to Mike Flanagan movies because I feel like in general his stuff is always that sort of extra smart, like understanding the tropes of horror and then going beyond it.
Exactly. He knows how to adapt King, and he does it really, really well.
Mike Flanagan. This is Mike Flanagan behind Ouija, Origins of Evil, and Gerald's Game on Netflix right now, right? So and also Haunting of Hill House
and Haunting of Hill House, yeah.
So
yes.
And quite the opposite in the new Pet Sematary, where characters do things that progressively become dumber as the movie continues. Right?
Let me look behind this mirror, okay? Because there's a strange, terrifying noise from my childhood emitting from it. Yes, yeah.
It's like the speech that Drew Barrymore gives at the beginning of Scream 1, and how like the person's always running up the stairs when they should be going out the back door. Like that's basically what characters in this film do metaphorically for the entire second half of the film. So that's one strike against it. And another thing is like I would say most of the movie, the look of it is pretty good. Like it convincingly depicts kind of rural life in Maine, and a lot of it is very beautifully done. But many of the horror aspects of it feel like they walk a very fine line between silly and scary, and often come out on the silly side of it, right? Like there's some scenes I'll discuss in spoilers, but there's some scenes that are like, when they occur, you're supposed to be scared, and I just think it looks very silly. There's some parts like the Pet Sematary of the title itself that looks like, just the look of it aesthetically is pretty rough, in my opinion. Like it looks fake, for lack of a better word. And I can get into it a little bit later, but like,
these kids have no sense of set design and art.
No, but I mean, I'm not talking about that specific
I get what you're
portion.
saying.
But and I think that like quite many movies, right? Like thinking about like Jordan Peele's Us, for instance. There's I'm gonna try to be as vague as possible, but there's like a scene when the Tethered give a speech for the first time. It's early on in the film, and that scene could be extremely silly, but like the commitment to the bit, the performance, all that stuff kind of sells it. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in this movie that it doesn't quite get sold, in my opinion. So
honestly, that may be also why it was harder to stomach this movie too, because it's like, how dare you release a half-baked horror movie when Us is out there right now still kicking ass? Like, what are you doing? Come on.
Well, you can't fault them for trying, but I understand what you're saying. It definitely doesn't compare favorably, right? So Ariel, were you gonna say something?
Well, no, to your point, Devendra, it feels very much like it's, I don't want to say it's a misunderstanding of what horror is. Clearly, these guys know what they're doing, but and the other thing too is comparing something like this to anything by Jordan Peele is also kind of unfair, because Jordan Peele's brand of horror is entirely different.
Yeah.
But there is a need to understand, like this has been a discourse within the last few months, especially, where people are, writing articles. What is elevated horror? Are we looking at a new generation of elevated horror? Somebody had tweeted a little while ago something that I quote tweeted that also went viral, that was saying these 4 movies saved horror, and it was The Witch, Hereditary, Us, and Get Out. And it's like, well, horror never needed to be saved. It's just always been multifaceted and very different, and representing a broad spectrum of human emotion, empathy, and the human experience. And we don't always see all of it because people write horror off a lot. And I think this film could have been a lot more, but I feel like perhaps somewhere on the back end, maybe producers got their hands in there a bit too much and thought, no, horror is supposed to be this, do this, as opposed to recognizing that you can make a horrific film and make a horror movie that's horrific, that doesn't necessarily, have the girl running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door, adhering to those tropes. You know what I mean?
I see what you're talking about in terms of tropes now. Yeah.
And certainly, by the way, this movie is harder to stomach after Hereditary, which feels like it did a very similar concept. Like the crux of what Hereditary is about, and like the grief that movie explores, is so extreme. It is so like, and it does it in a way that honestly kind of shook me to my core, because it came out of nowhere. We didn't really expect it. And that movie is a much better exploration of like grief and parents losing a child. It's a shame. I think it's even more of a shame that this movie came out, because it is kind of the same thing. Hereditary feels more Pet Sematary than this movie.
Yeah, actually, I fully agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the original Pet Sematary or read the book, but I definitely think that this movie, Pet Sematary, the new one, and I assume the book and the other film, are intended to be like a metaphor about grief, and I don't think it did a particularly good job landing that metaphor. Unfortunately, like I don't buy it, and we can talk a little bit more about why that's the case in spoilers, which we will start talking about right now. So let's talk about spoilers for Pet Sematary, and I mean, I think. So before we get into the spoilers, there's been some controversy online about the fact that apparently they changed which child was killed, right?
Which is a big deal.
In the new film, right? So
It is,
in the
yeah.
new film, it's the daughter that is killed, right? And apparently in the original, it was not the daughter, right? It was the son.
It was the son. It was Gage, and in the book, it's Gage as well.
Huh.
So that's something that was always there. And honestly, that switch in this film makes it feel really cheap because it feels like all they were doing was going for shock value.
Huh.
And I mean, but at the same time, it needs to be said, watching little Gage in his very strange funereal dress in the original film walk around with a scalpel, you know, I'm gonna get you. It's kind of hard to take him seriously as a threat because you could kind of just punt. You could kind of just punt the little bastard and it'll be fine.
The kid. I mean,
Exactly.
he really
Kick
racked
the
up a
baby.
body count, though. Yeah, kick the baby. He racked up a body count in that original film. And when I say like this movie, by the way, is just curbing from the original, like the whole like the evil child slicing through the Achilles tendon of Judd, that was Gage doing it. And I think like maybe watching it as a kid too, it was sort of like this thing where it's like, oh man, even this tiny child can be frightening. And I think there is something inherently weird about that, even though it seems like this little thing is not a threat. Mainly because that first movie, they did a really good job with the actual baby. Like I think Mary Lambert,
except for when he hit his head.
Except for when, oh man, that was
Do you
rough.
remember that?
Yeah, but there are definitely certain sequences where it feels almost real. Like they certainly replaced the actor with a puppet for really brutal scenes, but the idea that this cute little thing can be murderous, I think, was conveyed much more effectively. Whereas in this movie, it's a preteen girl. And there's a lot you can mine there, but I don't think this movie does. It's nowhere near as creepy, I think, as the idea of like a toddler wielding a scalpel and just wandering around the house. Yeah.
Well, I think it's kind of like a Child's Play situation, right? Like the film series Child's Play, where when I watched Child's Play, the first rated R film I ever saw, I think, was Child's Play 2, if I recall correctly. And that was pretty scary because at the time, you think that actually might be possible for a doll to do. But then when you grow up, you realize, oh, like you could just kick the doll or, hold the doll down or, like it's not like the doll has like the strength of a human, although I guess it does in the movie. But like
eventually,
eventually, right. And but according to the director, Dennis Widmeyer of the new film, Pet Sematary, he says, quote, there was something about an 8-year-old and the psychology that she would have. She would understand what happened to her on the road. She would understand that she's dead. And she would know how to not only physically kill a person, but psychologically destroy them as well. It just gave another layer to it, end quote. So I think
kids are evil.
Right. He's commenting on the fact that they made that change because it's very difficult to have a baby be a killer. And then also like having an 8-year-old be a killer, there's other things she can do other than just kill, right? She can psychologically destroy people as well. But it sounds like for both of you, Ariel and Devindra, that this change didn't really do its intended trick, right? Like it didn't really do what it was supposed to. Ariel, go ahead.
I mean, the big problem is that it fails to recognize that the main theme of the film is that, the main theme of the book. And again, this film doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have to consider, to some extent, its source material, which is both the original film and the book. And the book hinges largely on the horrors of death and loss, the horrors of losing a child, and also very fundamentally the fact that you may love them unconditionally, but sometimes parents really, really hate their kids. And they can be a terror. They can make your life insane. They can make you want to pull out your hair. They can make you lose sleep and stop functioning like a normal human being. Like, let's be honest. There's a lot of stuff that comes out of horrible situations like postpartum depression and things like that, that people kind of look down their nose at. Oh, you're not supposed to say that you hate your kids sometimes. You're not supposed to say they piss you off or they annoy you. But the truth is that for many people they do, and that's normal and healthy and okay. like, you're never going to kill your kid. You're never going to do these things, right?
Mhm.
But the book really taps into how you can resent your children and how that's a normal emotion for a human adult.
Right.
And that losing them is fearful. So in having Gage come back and be this real threat, it's the horror of watching, you know, your child come back to life, this other thing that's not themselves. But it's also really just watching the reincarnation demon child that you always thought your child was, to an extent, I guess. And even beyond that, it starts to tap on, well, this movie did a better job of adapting some of the book than the original film did, in that it's not actually them that's coming back, it's a demon. It's maybe a bit of the Wendigo. Like, we get a little bit of this piecemeal. Admittedly, I didn't get all the way through the book, so I can't quite touch on what winds up happening. But ultimately, the impression that we're being given is whatever you bury there isn't coming back. It's something else using that corpse as a vessel. So he was never bringing his daughter back. Church never came back.
Yeah.
Something else came back through them. And that's how they knew all of the little details. That's how we got, you know, that facial recognition of Norma, Judd's wife, and that's a whole other thing. And, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm talking too much. I'm not sure. But
I think that you're right, though, that this movie, like, very well said regarding the horrors of child raising and how a movie could theoretically tap into them. I don't think this movie really did that at all, in my opinion. And the thing that it was supposed to tap into, this idea that, like, this father is so racked with grief from his daughter's death, I don't know that I bought that he would be so racked with grief that he would actually do this horrible thing. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
That's the ultimate. That's the decision that the entire film hinges on. And he is so racked with grief. He's gonna go, like, at whatever the cost. He's gonna bring her back. And I just didn't believe that the relationship had been set up to be that way. And that's largely a function of the fact that you don't really get to know the main character that much, or whoever,
exactly,
you know, the doctor character, right? Like, you don't really know what makes him tick, like adjectives. I struggled to come up with adjectives to describe his character.
He's Jason Clarke as a leading guy again, which we've seen plenty of times recently.
You know, I read this cool article recently about Jason Clarke for Vulture called "In Praise of Jason Clarke, Hollywood's Go-To Cuckold," and it's about how, like, in I think 5 of the last 8 movies he's been in, or whatever, like some large percentage of the last movies he's been in, he plays a cuckold, like somebody whose wife cheats on him. Which I thought was, like, what is it about Jason Clarke's face that makes it seem like he's like an unsympathetic husband character, that he wants to play that character over and over again? Anyway, there's something about him. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
It is amazing when that happened to John Connor, too. Like, nobody expected John Connor to be cuckolded, but Jason Clarke, man.
And you want to talk about failures in marketing, like,
oh god. What was I going to say? I think this movie actually does a better job than the original film of selling that sort of grief, because you're right, the entire movie kind of hinges on that. This movie also avoids the even dumber, like, spoiler for the original Pet Sematary, but the even dumber thing is that even after the whole business happens with the evil baby killing everybody, in the first film, he goes back and he buries his wife, just to do it all over again. And it leads to this great little twist ending. And I never quite, that showed, like, the madness of that character, like, sort of like Jack from The Shining, like, just being driven insane to the point where he is making crazy decisions and maybe he's being led by the demon or something. But I never quite bought that in the first movie. So, yeah.
This is a huge failing of both films. They talk about this in the book. The whatever the power is that's in the place beyond the deadfall, beyond the actual Pet Sematary on the Micmac burial ground, that power, once you go there, it influences the rest of your life and your decisions. So the reason why he buries the reason why he buries Gage there in the book is because it's reaching out to him and convincing him this is a good idea, despite the fact that he's had this long conversation with Judd, who's telling him about Timmy. I can't remember the last name, but the one other human he knows about that was buried there. And they don't touch on that at all. That's not clear in any way, shape, or form, that the decisions that are being made are not being made by him completely. Like, he's being pushed by something.
It almost feels like they need like The Shining, like aside sequences where they're just like talking to the ghost or something, or like, you know, having this situation where they're physically embodied, and then you see that influence happening.
There's also a huge loss of character motivation, in my opinion. I think in the book, one of the big things that we have is Judd's wife, Norma, is alive. She suffers a heart attack during the earlier parts of the book, and Lewis saves her. And that's Judd's motivation to help him bring Church back from the dead.
Oh, wow.
Because you saved my wife. I have to do something for you.
Rather than your child is just going to be sad that their cat is dead.
Exactly, which feels so hollow in comparison.
So weak, yeah.
Like, if you're going to do, this is the big thing for me. I don't really give a shit about films being, you know, word for word translations of their source material. I don't think that's the most necessary thing. But I think sticking to character motivation, tone, pacing, because like the book is supposed to take place over almost the better part of a year. And the first film feels like it's maybe 2 months. And
whereas
this
in
film
this
feels
like, that was sure an eventful week we had.
Weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And you don't really get that weight or that sense of any kind of investment of time. Like, the pacing feels weird. Character motivation is just all over the place. Like, it just doesn't jive or make sense. I always refer to one of my absolute favorite adaptations and one of my favorite movies, and incidentally one of my favorite books, is The Age of Innocence, which Scorsese adapted, of all people. And it was perfection. And there were a ton of changes, but he brought it to the screen in terms of the sensation it elicits and its pacing and its tone. And that's infinitely harder to do. It sometimes takes a lot more time, but it's ultimately the most worthwhile process. And this, to me, just doesn't do that. It also fails to understand Stephen King at its core, which, to be fair, Stephen King himself doesn't seem to understand with any adaptations he's had his hands in. So,
for sure. Like, he wrote the screenplay for the first Pet Sematary movie too. So that was one of the early ones he was involved with. So, in knowing how much he hates The Shining, it's like, I don't know if we can really trust his opinion on his own work when it's translated to film. I don't know. Let me ask you guys this, by the way. Like, who do you think is the real villain of this movie? Because it's really based on the facts we see in this film, and maybe the first film too. Like, it's really kind of Judd. And it's also like the traffic laws of that little town, which do nothing to protect the families that live on this highway, and this truck company that's just like
drivers.
Yeah, exactly. And the truck's just barreling down. There's so much going on here. I just think it's kind of funny.
I think the person who I was least sympathetic to is the father character, the doctor. Right? And let me do that again.
Sorry.
The person who I was least sympathetic to is the father character, the doctor, because after he sees the cat being brought back to life and what misery that wreaks upon their lives, he then goes back and is like, "Hey, I'm gonna double down on this." Now, at this point, we said like virtually nothing good about this film. Yeah. And there are some decent scares in the film, right? So like, there's some decent jump scares. Like I felt very, I was totally fine with how the jump scares played out. You know, there's sometimes like the number of jump scares, the character of the jump scares get really irritating in a film. But I thought like most of these jump scares were pretty earned. There's a very creepy moment that pays off when the daughter character, who by the way I think is awesome in this film, like the actress who plays the daughter, like her transition from being a normal girl to like undead version of herself is very convincing in every respect, and so I really liked her performance. I think Jette Lawrence, is that her name? Jette Lawrence?
Exactly.
Yeah. So she's great. And there's a moment early in the film when she's kind of brushing Church's hair, the cat's hair, and then like it's like getting stuck. Like the brush is getting stuck on her hair, and it causes the cat to like lash out. Later on, that scene is repeated when Jason Clarke's character is brushing her hair in the bathtub, and it gets stuck. But the reason it gets stuck is because it's like caught on these staples in her skull, because presumably like they've done some work to her skull to make it look appropriate for a funeral. And I thought that was like a very creepy moment. And so there's like a handful of solid moments like that. I'm partial to the last shot of the film, actually.
Really?
Which is when the family kind of... I mean, they return and they happen upon Gage in the car, and you just know like Gage is going to get screwed over. And then who knows what happens after that? A whole army of the undead, probably, right? That's what's going to happen next.
By the way, yet another thing where they're like, oh man, this first movie sure had a great final shot. Let's do our own take on that. And Dave, I'm sorry to spoil this for you.
Please, spoil
because
it.
I think certain bits of the first movie are gangbusters. But yeah, the very end of the first movie, he goes back, he buries his wife. He just sits in the kitchen, waits for his wife to come back, and she appears, and she is like half decomposed. Her eyeball is oozing. Her face is like, it is great special effects work there. And then he just goes in for like, oh yeah, baby, I've been missing this, and he goes in for the full-on kiss. So as a kid, I just imagined the grossness of like literally just making out with a corpse. But while she's kissing him, she reaches for a knife, and we don't see what happens, but it just cuts to black after that. I think there is a sound, but I think that moment there's a lot of momentum there. Like it is a surprise. It feels impactful. Whereas this one, it's like, well, they gather around the car. I guess we kind of expected them all. We kind of knew this was coming, right? We expected them all to be undead at this point. And it just feels like they didn't, whatever shot they landed on just felt kind of whiffed. Like it didn't feel particularly interesting. We hear the car, like, is it the car? Did they unlock the car doors? Maybe. Let's see. You hear the click, click of that. But it didn't feel like they actually did much. There's no real expression on the kid's face, and maybe that's one thing I also really enjoyed from the first movie, because that poor baby had some great on-screen moments of really selling the horror. There's a point in the first film where the father finally like manages to stop the baby by injecting him with like a sedative or something, and the kid just walks away saying, not fair, not fair. And that imagery, that tone has been stuck in my head my entire life. And it's just like a really indelible image. Whereas this one's like, well, the kid's in the car and they surround the car. We're just going to cut to black.
Okay, so Devindra, I hate that you've made me defend this film, but here we go. I mean, I think if you accept the premise that this movie is about grief and how like grief will make you do horrible things, and that like hanging on to the dead, literally, as is the case in this film, right? Hanging on to the dead will become an infection, a cancer that destroys your whole family. Then I think that last shot ultimately pays that off. Now, I think it's like, hey, it's gotten to everyone else in the family, and like now it's finally going to like ruin.
It's
this
more
child,
the tech. Like, right? I like the idea of the shot. I think that it's the technique of the shot that I wasn't particularly impressed with.
Fair enough.
And maybe it's also because we once again cut to black, and it's a cover of the Ramones' Pet Sematary song. Because that's all this movie feels like it is a cover.
Yes, actually, that's a perfect way of putting it. And let's face it, I mean, good effort, but it's an inferior copy. Like the song, I mean, even just on its own.
Well, to be fair, I think that I don't know that the movie lands the grief message particularly well for reasons we've already discussed. Like, you don't really know what the dad's like his goal is. There's just so many baffling plot aspects to this film. Okay, like for instance, why didn't they make the mother character like the main character? That's what I didn't understand. Amy Seimetz's character, because she at least has stuff she needs to get over. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like the Jason Clarke character, like what is his issue? Like,
no, Dave. How about in the middle of the movie we stop everything and go over her backstory, which seems completely tangential to everything that's happening here.
So a couple issues with her backstory. Number one, it's obvious. Like I think it's like kind of a very ableist message of like this person was disabled and therefore they're horrifying and disgusting, right? I mean that's the impression I got from what
certainly. By the way, they didn't fix anything from the first movie, and they actually they doubled down on that idea. Although I think the idea of a child taking care of somebody who's dying and like the unfairness of that and how like scary that could be to a child, I think that's certainly something you can tap into. But the design of the of Zelda is literally just a copy from the first movie. So it's
Yeah.
like,
Well,
I heard the first
skeletal
film was
stuff.
like much more into the whole like Native American spirits thing, which might have been like more offensive. And so maybe they dialed that back, but they kept the kind of
No, I feel like they talked about that more here,
Oh,
honestly.
with the
yeah,
book and
a little
everything?
bit. They
Yeah.
did.
They didn't even mention Wendigo in the first movie.
Oh, interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway,
but also-
the scene when like he crashes down onto the dumbwaiter, it's
Mhm.
supposed to be scary, but I just thought it looked very silly. You know, like it's my question's like, how did she get in there, and like what was
Oh,
like
yeah.
when that girl crashes down in the dumbwaiter, you're supposed to be like, oh my gosh, that's horrifying. Like that's the reaction you're supposed to have, I think.
Yeah.
And instead, I just was like, what is even happening? Like, how did that happen? You know, how did she
Well,
get in
yeah.
there, and how did she? You know, like that's what it was on my mind, and so I don't think it
Uh-huh.
had the effect, right? Like
I
that
think
it was
it's a
supposed
little
to
more dramatic than the first movie, I guess, which is you see Zelda twisting in the bed and she's like choking and suffocating, and that's it. She just kind of like chokes on the bed. Whereas this is much more. It's more of like a direct impact of something the wife character actually did.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
like,
like she's-
how?
yeah.
How it just.
But
Crawled
is-
across the floor.
Yeah,
and
she like
lifted
she
herself
tried to
up.
get her food, and
Yeah,
then instead ended up in the dumbwaiter. You know,
I
it
think
just,
the mechanics of this feel like like she reached in and fell in. Like I could see how that works. That's not the part that doesn't work for me. It's
All right.
more like you are just copying again. You're just copying what came before. Give us something new.
which is the thing, they're not actually copying what came before.
Yeah,
This is completely new and totally different. And the first film actually sticks a little bit closer because what happened was she was choking, but Rachel never went upstairs. She never went in to check on her. She just heard her throttling around and suffocating. As far as I remember, keep in mind, I'm recovering from a head injury, so I might be forgetting pieces, just for the record.
Yeah.
But the whole thing with that, and that gets a little complicated in and of itself too, because the representation of Rachel's parents in the book is pretty atrocious. She's Jewish, number one. And to preface, before I even get into any of this, I myself am Jewish. Her parents are represented as miserly Jews, the terrible example, like caricature that
Right.
people have always painted of Jewish people. King did that. And he went full tilt. He calls the kippah or yarmulke a skull cap when he's at the funeral. He paints the father as being cheap. He's the only character that gets referred to by their last name, which he chose. I can't remember if it's Goldberg or Goldfarb, which, I mean, try a little harder, please.
Yeah.
But and then Rachel's Judaism is completely erased. So it's just this horrible man who he gets to pick on and point out that he's Jewish all the time. So that's terrible, number one. Number two, we have Rachel, who, as a child in the book, was left alone. She was 8 years old, and she was left alone with her significantly older, disabled sister to take care of her so that the parents could go out at night and go to a party. That's why she was at home. And
So
to
they're
be fair,
cartoonishly evil. The parents are cartoonishly evil.
Oh, yeah.
basically.
they're
There's a fight
cartoonishly evil.
In the funeral in the first movie, like there's a fight,
And that's
where-
in the book.
Oh boy, the father starts yelling at at the father character in the film and like knocks over the coffin, and the body
And-
comes out.
And
It's
true to
awful.
form, King tried to include as much of that as possible from the book, and a lot of that was in the book, even it kind of popping open and you see his hand. And all of that is in there, but it's all directly attached to the Judaism of the character, which is hugely problematic and pisses me off to no end. But in this, you don't get any of that. It's just she was home alone, and instead of having the fear painted as a child's imagination running wild, they just kind of went for broke and turned everything up to 11 and decided to truly make Zelda into a real monster. Because that's not what spinal meningitis looks like, folks. I hate to
Right,
break it to you. Google it. You'll take a quick look and know immediately that that's a lot of creative licensing. And it's just...
That's a shame because I get all my medical information from Stephen King films. So this is really disappointing to hear. Anyway,
I'm so sorry.
thank
Didn't
you
mean to
for
break your
shattering my world there. Yeah, so I think you're also expressing your disappointment with this scene in the new film as well, right?
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
It just doesn't do it. Like, it's creepy, sure, and the whole thing of Zelda being this terrifying part that gave kids nightmares in, the late 80s, early 90s is, fully accurate. But instead of that being something that little kids could look at and go, wow, that's horrifying, and you can kind of put yourself into the vantage point of thinking that would be terrifying for a child. They're just making her into part of a creature feature, and that's not what this is supposed to be.
Right, right. Well, I think the thing that was most confusing is that then why not make Amy Simons' character the main parent character, right? Because at least she has like, oh, she let a family member die, and like now, like her wanting to undo that at no matter what the cost would make some kind of sense, right? Instead, all the Jason Clarke character has is the random dude that he didn't save in the ER, which, by the way, like,
let's talk about that.
Pretty rough scene because, first of all, like, you're supposed to be seeing his brain, but it's like the makeup is protruding like out of his head very clearly, right? So it's like the effect is not super convincing. And then this guy says like the portal, like the what does he call it? Says like the door has been breached or something like that. He says like the barrier has been breached, like the barrier between the worlds,
been broken. Yeah,
broken.
Like this is some Twin Peaks shit.
Yeah, like what is he talking like? But like what is he talking about? Like
I will say, at least this movie has less of that ghost, because my God, in the first movie, it is everywhere. It is on the plane with the wife. It is in a truck as the wife is like hitchhiking home. Like it is ridiculous.
I don't care how much of it he has. I'm curious. Like, is there a reason? Like, is there any explanation for what that character is supposed to be?
He is just like laying out the plot, like basically, right?
He's supposed to be a spirit guide. That's his function.
Yeah, see,
he was a student on campus who was jogging, and he was run over by a car, and then he died in his surgical wing or whatever in the hospital at the university. And then he haunted him, and he kind of acted as this vessel to guide him kind of get away from all the shit that he winds up doing. But
fails miserably.
That almost makes this a lot worse though, because, and I think we would be, I mean, other people have had the same bone to pick, and I feel remiss if I didn't bring it up.
Pick it.
Victor Pascow is Victor Pascow is a white dude in the book. I'm not sitting here going, oh, we shouldn't be having more diverse casts. That's not it at all. You literally took a white character who served as a spiritual guide, and you gave it to a black actor who you then with one fell swoop transformed into the magical Negro trope that we've been trying to fight against for decades. Like it to me, that casting decision felt really counterintuitive and counterproductive. I don't think it needed to happen. And frankly, especially after things like Horror Noir have come out on Shudder talking about misrepresentation in horror films, making that decision feels like a really backhanded move. Like it just doesn't really take into account the significance of how we choose our casting decisions. In any other situation, it wouldn't matter, but this is, I mean, they've been like, this has been an issue for decades. Like, let's not make the conscious decision to put that in the foreground of a major motion picture right now, guys.
I guess I was just, I think it's a valid point, but I'm also just like very confused at what the character is even talking about. Like he's saying the barrier has been breached, but like but isn't it implied that people have been burying, animals and all kinds of shit in this pet cemetery for years now? Right? Like
here's the other,
Why is it now that the barrier has been breached? Like hasn't it been breached like decades ago? And then like Judd's wife coming back, and like that the way that was explained, I thought was very poor. I didn't even understand what they were saying about Judd's wife, right? And she was alive in the first film, but like in this movie, I don't really get what it's done so quickly. Like the dialogue is so fast that I didn't really understand what they're trying to say with that character. So I was less, I was more confused at like what is the supernatural metaphysical nature of what is going on during the course of this film, right? That's what I was more confused about.
It's just one of many things that just became really muddled and a little messy, because instead of trying to bring the character motivation out of the source material, they were just trying to bring the original film back to life. And I think that's where they messed up ultimately. Like, yes, there are a lot of really great scares. Zelda is genuinely terrifying in this film. Did she need to be? Not so much. Would we have benefited from getting a bit more character motivation out of Judd, from getting, more of anything out of Jason Clarke as Lewis, switching things up a little, making Rachel and Amy Simons take the lead, giving that to the mother instead of the father? Like, you could make changes and have them work, but ultimately instead of doing that, they just kind of tried to paint by numbers and left out a lot of the nuance in the background, because Victor Pascow is way too prominent in the first film. You're right. But he's really transparent here and feels rather ornamental, where he doesn't need to. Like, there's holes, and there's just, I think there's just a lot of mistakes here and mishandlings of the material. Personally, I know I'm going to piss a lot of people off with that, but frankly,
I don't think so. I think this movie is not doing that well critically anyway. But it's interesting to speak with both of you and reflect on how it went wrong. So
I think you would be fascinated to watch the original film, Dave. Like, at some point,
Definitely.
if you're bored, like, there's some really good stuff there, and then you look at that and be like, this movie, this remake, has even less inventiveness than you thought it did.
Well, I'll say even your description of that final shot seemed like really cool. Like, that seems like something I want to see. You know,
it has its place. It's a lot of fun. Like, it's
really
silly,
good.
it's pretty tongue in cheek, but it's kind of a blast. Like, Lambert did a great job with it.
Have you guys seen Pet Sematary 2?
No,
I have not.
That movie stars Edward Furlong and who else?
Wait
Clancy
a second.
Brown.
You're telling me?
Yep, Clancy Brown.
You're
Clancy
telling me
Brown.
that the Pet Sematary franchise has starred 2 John Connors?
2 John Connors. This is where
John
we are.
Connors.
And
That's
also
crazy.
Clancy Brown as his stepfather, and Clancy Brown comes back from the dead. That movie is bonkers, but it's a ton of fun. Like, that movie actually aims to be like kind of fun and kind of comedic, but I remember really digging it. I don't know if it really holds up though.
It has a
All I've ever
24%
heard is
Rotten
that part
Tomatoes.
2. Yeah.
Yeah.
All I've ever heard is that part 2 is supposed to be amazing, and that was also Mary Lambert. But I think she was given a bit more creative freedom with that one.
I think the fact that she was able to, like, go from, and the first movie was super successful too, like, she was able to do a sequel on her own terms, which is even more bonkers, I think is more fun. So I'm looking forward to revisiting that. And I've read a couple interviews too. Mary Lambert apparently really wants to remake The Dead Zone. I would love to see that. That sounds great for today.
Yeah, that would be cool. I wonder who the politician would be. Anyway, so yeah, that's our review of Pet Sematary. Then, unfortunately, it was a huge disappointment. I saw this movie in Dolby. Actually, I want you to know, I saw it in Dolby, and it actually did work for the jump scares. I thought it did enhance them a little bit.
Because they move the seats, like the seats punch you a little.
Yeah, they
for
punch
those
you a
noises,
little bit.
so it's
Yeah.
good.
Actually, before we wrap up, there is one thing I must bring up, which is that there is a moment in Arrested Development, which is now a meme, right? And it's Job looking kind of off into the middle distance and saying, "I've made a huge mistake." Right? And I quote that line to my wife all the time, and we kind of like, we quote Arrested Development to each other a lot, but like that's one of like the classic lines. And if you search on Twitter, like, or anywhere for GIFs, like, "I've made a huge mistake," like Job's face pops up and it's very funny. And I felt like this movie was "I've made a huge mistake" the movie. And there's like
And I
it's
keep
like
making them.
Yeah, and it's this character
Continually.
doing these really stupid things. But there's literally that scene where the daughter has just come back to life, and they're lying in bed together, and Jason Clarke's looking up at the ceiling. He has the exact same look as Joe Bluth does in that scene when he says, "I've made a huge mistake."
Just play the Arrested Development theme there and cut the movie. Like, go to credits.
Yeah,
I would watch that. I think that would be infinitely more enjoyable, honestly.
indeed. All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for today on the Slash Filmcast here. Stay tuned to hear what we'll be discussing next week. But in the meantime, you can find more episodes of this podcast at slashfilmcast.com. Email us at slashfilmcast@gmail.com. Our spoiler bumper comes from filmmaker Kyle Hillinger. Our theme song comes from adamwarrock.com. And our Slash Film Court theme, which we use occasionally, comes from simonmharris.com. This episode was produced by Beatty Zhang. So stay tuned for what we'll be discussing next week. In the meantime, Ariel Fisher, where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
This week, unfortunately, there's not much to do. I'm recovering from a concussion, so I haven't been doing much. But you can find me in general on Twitter at AFIS8, AFIS8. That's my handle pretty much everywhere, and I share everything I do on various social medias. So long as you search that, you're pretty good.
Ariel, it's been a delight to have you on this episode, and hope you had a good time,
Thank
and
you.
hope to have you on in the future.
Yes, please.
Devindra, where can we find more of your stuff?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter at Devindra. I write about tech at engadget.com. I'm also doing a tech podcast at nomortech.net. That's no with a K.
And you find all of my stuff at davechen.net. I'm also hosting a podcast about Game of Thrones called A Cast of Kings. You can find that at gameofthronespodcast.com. Next week...
By the way, Dave, I heard you on NPR with a certain Joanna Robinson. Congrats.
Thanks.
On being featured.
Yeah, I was recently featured on All Things Considered with my co-host, Joanna Robinson. And yeah, that was a delight. All Things Considered, one of my favorite public radio shows. So
I was making dinner, and they were like, "We're going to talk about Game of Thrones podcast." And I was like, "Of course it's going to be Joanna, but which one?" And of course it's Dave. So
yeah.
that was great.
Yeah,
was
awesome. It was a delight to be featured, and always fascinating to see like how people who are hyper competent at radio, put together the show. Right. We recorded like 30 minutes of discussion, and they edited it down to like this 5.5 like best minutes.
Man.
And it's cool. I love observing it as just someone.
You were in studio for that too?
No. So what we did, because like when you're dealing with me and Joanna, you're dealing with a team. We like recorded our own audio using our own microphones, and they spliced it together.
Oh
so,
wow, that's very nice.
Yeah. So it was really great to do. And you can hear that on All Things Considered, or find that at the NPR website. And, of course, you can listen to me and Joanna at GameOfThronesPodcast.com. But, yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks to all the people who, like, shouted out when they heard that. I got some random messages from people being like, I was driving home from work and I heard you on the radio. So that was fun. But, anyway, next week is the Summer Movie Wager. And it's going to be pretty fun. So stay tuned to hear what movies we predict.
Yeah, summer in April, everybody.
What movies we predict will be the top 10 movies of the summer by domestic box office. So, and again, you can enter yourself at thesummermoviewager.com to be featured in our leaderboard. You just need to enter by, I think, April 24th, 11:59 p.m. Pacific time, and you will be able to enter our leaderboard for the Summer Movie Wager. So check that out. And again, thanks to Dennis for making all that Summer Movie Wager stuff happen this year. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next week on the Slash Filmcast. Okay, so we're still broadcasting live, but the episode will end right there. And Devindra, I'm going to talk about that stuff with the website earlier on in the podcast. So it makes sense
I
referred to it just now as though I'd already talked about it.
Okay.
But Ariel, this is so much fun. Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. I had a great time.
Same. We'll be in touch for a future appearance. Glad we could find. This has been months in the making. Like Ariel at the beginning of the year gave me I was like, I read that Birth Movies Death article, and then I said, Ariel, we should have you on the podcast. And I was like, give me some movie titles of movies that you'd want to review. And she gave me like 15 movies, and I was finally one of them came up that I was like, we don't have a guest on for this one, and so we were able to make it happen. So
excellent.
Months. That was like 3 months ago, but now it's fun. I don't forget.
Like that,
a Lannister always pays his debts. So so have a good night, and we'll talk soon.
Good night.
Sounds good. Bye.
Cool. I'm going to run to the bathroom.
Okay, I will do the same. And if you're listening in the chat room, we'll be back in like a minute. I'm just going to keep the tape rolling. Okay.
Back.
All right. Is what's here what you want to discuss?
I was thinking anything else.
We can talk about anything, really.
Yeah,
because we have plenty of time.
My Life is good one. I'm going to just say some brief Game of Thrones thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we could do a whole like HBO thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah.
You've been seeing all the HBO
That's true.
stuff.
Do that. Yeah,
We can talk about all the HBO stuff.
Yep.
All right, you ready?
Yep.
I mean, I'm rolling anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Fine. I'm good.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Slash Filmcast. I'm David Chen, and with me is
Adventure Hardwire.
Jeff Kanata is off this week, but we have a awesome guest coming on later on the show. Ariel Fisher will join us for our main review, which is going to happen later this episode. But first, we're going to start with some what we've been watching, and then that's before we move on into our review of Pet Sematary this week. So, let me just do that again. That was like really, that's really muddled. That was pretty rough. Let me do that again. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Slash Filmcast. I'm David Chen, and with me is
Adventure Hardwire.
And Jeff Kanata is off this week, but we have a great guest appearing on the show later today, Ariel Fisher. We're going to start this week by discussing some what we've been watching, and then move on into an in-depth review of Pet Sematary, the new remake on Stephen King's horror classic. So that's what we got in store for the show this week. But before we get to any of that, there is a momentous announcement we have to make, which is that at some point in the near future, probably next week, the Summer Movie Wager is coming back. And
oh boy.
I don't know why this is so popular with our audience, but there is a huge segment of our audience that really loves this wager. Probably because they like seeing me annihilate you guys at games. That's my guess.
I think it's more they like seeing Dave just stress for so much of the year, right? Like that must be it.
Yeah. So
yeah.
As with previous years, you can keep track of all the fun at thesummermoviewager.com. And for those who don't know what the Summer Movie Wager is, it is an annual game whereby we select the top 10 films of the summer by domestic box office. You can find all the rules at thesummermoviewager.com. You can find past games that we've played and so on. And it's generally a blast. We're really appreciative to Dennis, one of our listeners, for building this website and maintaining it year after year. It has lots of trivia. It has real-time updating leaderboards and so on and so forth. And if you want to be included in the leaderboard, you can actually enter the Summer Movie Wager with your top 10 picks of the summer right now by going to thesummermoviewager.com, clicking on the Play Along button. And as long as you enter before April 24th, 11:59 p.m. Pacific time, you will be included in the leaderboard for this year. Now, why, pray tell, is April 24th, 2019, 11:59 p.m. the cutoff? That is because that is the day before Avengers Endgame is released in theaters, right? And so the idea is that once Avengers Endgame is released, we will know how much money Avengers Endgame will make, and that will give you critical information for whether or not it will be number one at the box office this summer. And we don't want you to have that before you are going to be part of the leaderboard. So if you want to enter, again, go to thesummermoviewager.com and click on Play Along. You can enter in and be part of the leaderboard this year. Devindra, I don't want to tip our hand, but like, what are you thinking in terms of Avengers Endgame? You feeling that's going to be your number one pick this summer?
Maybe solid number 2. We'll see. We'll see how
really?
it goes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. As I mentioned, I'm considering picking Avengers Endgame just to spite you, as number 2, right? And choosing a different film at number 1.
I mean, you could do that, Dave. If you're brave enough, please go ahead.
I'm so strongly considering it. I actually was genuinely considering it until AMC's website melted down during the Avengers Endgame presale.
Something that's never happened before in
Yeah,
cinema history.
it's not only the like ticketing website, but the actual
Everything.
like corporate website was down as well. Like like all their servers were just completely toast. And then Fandango did an interesting thing as well. That they basically put you in a queue, right? They like put you in a line if you tried to order Avengers Endgame tickets. And you couldn't get your Avengers Endgame ticket. It's like, hey, you're in line. Wait like an hour and 20 minutes.
That's actually the way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you disclose like how you're planning to see Avengers Endgame, Devindra?
Well, I have I have a screening.
Oh,
it's
wow.
going to be an IMAX, and I'm very excited about that. I actually did manage to buy tickets for opening night too, but I'll probably just refund that.
I bought
the best new feature in Fandango. Yeah,
I bought tickets for opening night, and I bought tickets for Saturday morning 9 a.m.
You really want to do this again?
Well, then after that, I got like a press screening, and it was one of the most beautiful days of my life when I got that press screening because then it's like I don't have to like fight the crowds to see the film. So I'm very excited about that. And then after I see the screening, I will then decide if I want to. I don't think I'm going to see it 3 times in 1 week.
This is the world you live. Like the life you live is the luxury of seeing Endgame 3 times in a week.
But because apparently it's difficult to actually get tickets, right, to see it at all.
Yeah.
But there's some theaters that are playing it around the clock. Have you seen that? Like
I have seen that.
Some of my theaters are playing it like 4 a.m. Right? There's like a 4 a.m. screening of Avengers Endgame. Mm-hmm. So I am very curious. Obviously, we're going to review Avengers Endgame on the podcast, but I'm very curious. Like, is it going to be the kind of movie that you want to see more than once?
It's
you know what
3 hours long.
It's 3 hours long.
3 hours of superheroes punching each other. Come on.
And I have not seen the trailer for Avengers Endgame yet, but I have been in a theater and closed my eyes during the trailer, right? So I'll hear kind of the music and stuff, which, by the way, gets me super amped.
And let me tell you, you're not missing much.
It sounds like a pretty depressing movie. I'm just going to say, like, just not having seen the trailer, I've heard the trailer, and it sounds pretty depressing, right? So I'm curious, are they going to be able to do a 3-hour-long movie that like people want to go back and see again, right? Like that's what I'm curious about.
This is Lawrence of Arabia for a whole new generation. I don't know what's going to happen.
It's this generation's Lawrence of Arabia. So many questions. I mean,
I want this whole thing to be over. So let's just keep going. Let's just
you want this whole thing to be over.
Enough of Avengers Endgame. Come on.
So you obviously really didn't like Infinity. Like it sounds like you're over it. You're just like
I am over it. I'm certainly over it. Like I'm enjoying the smaller superhero movies. You weren't here for Shazam, but have you seen Shazam, Dave?
I have seen Shazam. That's right.
It's a lot of fun. I want more of that. Give me more of that fun stuff because I think I was irked by the way Infinity War was handled. And I've talked about this, and it's early on our end of year podcast. So it was probably my most disappointing movie last year. I hope Endgame does better, and honestly, I just hope it does good by these characters. My biggest problem with Infinity War was I think it didn't treat a lot of those characters really well because it was rushing to the next thing. So maybe with more room to breathe, maybe it'll be better.
Former /Filmcast guest Patrick Willems released a video essay series about the Marvel franchise. You see this?
No.
So actually, I want to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to just say we need to pause and reflect on the fact that we have just recently completed a crossover event nearly as ambitious as Avengers Infinity War.
Yes,
which is we got both members of the Blank Check podcast on the /Filmcast in consecutive weeks. I mean, that is awesome, and I'm grateful to you guys for doing the show without me last week. And it was really, really fun to have David Sims on the show a couple weeks ago. But love Blank Check, the show, and loved having those guys on the /Filmcast. And I'm really just grateful that we were able to make it happen. And hope everyone listening enjoyed those episodes. So, okay, moving on. Patrick Willems did this a series of video essays about the Marvel Universe. And the impetus for that series of video essays, one of which stars former guest of last week's episode of the podcast, Griffin Newman, it's all a very incestuous world here in the podcasting world. But the video essay series is basically talking about the limitations of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it starts with the question of like, why isn't Patrick Willems more psyched about Avengers Endgame? Because theoretically, as a nerd, like he should be super psyched, and he kind of explores like why he's not more psyched.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons is that like these movies are based on comic books, right? And one of the great things about comic books is you get to see how these characters change and learn and grow over time. And that is largely a process that is elided in the films, right? I'll just throw out a couple of examples. So I'm going to spoil everything through Avengers Infinity War.
I mean,
right?
what are you talking about? Tony Stark started out being a serving, conceited playboy billionaire, and he's ended being that same guy on a spaceship. Like, come on.
He's slightly more selfless, Devindra, but I think there's some major decisions that get made in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that are then just undone rapidly in subsequent films, like with almost no explanation. So, example, Spider-Man: Homecoming. At the end of that film, Peter Parker's like, hey, you know what? I don't want to be an Avenger, right? That's like a big moment when he's like, I don't want to be an Avenger. I want to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, blah, blah, blah.
Give me 6 months until the release of Avengers Infinity War.
Yeah,
please.
And then 6 months later, he's like, you know what? I can't be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man unless if there is no neighborhood. That's what he says in the new film, right? And so it's like,
I mean, to be honest, yes, there's a giant spaceship over Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, okay,
now you gotta get it.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. But still, you know what I mean? like.
Well, how about like S.H.I.E.L.D. crumbling and falling apart because it was actually, an evil Nazi organization? Like the TV series, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of dealt with that. The movies, not so much.
Well, yeah, I mean, because in the next film, they're basically S.H.I.E.L.D. is basically just like Nick Fury instead, right? It serves the same function. Nick Fury serves the function that S.H.I.E.L.D. served in the earlier movies,
with a much smaller budget, and that's it.
Right. So it doesn't change the dynamic of the Nick Fury Avengers relationship that much. Yeah. And then I would say the one that like baffles me the most is at the end of Iron Man 3, Tony Stark decides to blow up all the Iron Men, and then and he gets the thing taken out of his chest.
Yeah.
Right? And then like in the next movie, the thing's back in his chest, and then all the Iron Men
It's a different thing. It's a different thing.
It's a different thing.
It's not the thing keeping him alive. It's a thing making him stronger.
Yeah, that's right.
I think.
No, good call, Devindra. But you know what I mean? Like,
it is very It feels like we didn't really gain much there.
So I think the issue is right. Like, what is these characters make these huge decisions during these movies, but then like by the time you get to the next movie, they've already lived an entire lifetime between those films, right?
Yeah.
And you don't see it. You don't see what happened. And usually the movies return things to the status quo, right? So you have like another S.H.I.E.L.D. or version of S.H.I.E.L.D. You have Tony Stark still being Iron Man. You know, like the characters from movie to movie, the status quo changes very little. And that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the franchise is you don't get to see all the in-between stuff. All the stuff that happened between the movies, like Vision and Wanda's love story. You know, like you don't see any of that stuff. They just start in that state. And it'll be curious to see if Avengers Endgame, I have a feeling, Devindra, that the stakes are going to be real this time. Like, I have a feeling that there's going to be some irreversible stuff that goes on in Avengers Endgame.
Give me some actual death. Give me some characters actually moving on and putting, hanging up their mantles or whatever. We need actual, change. We need actual consequences, and I need stakes. That's all I want.
I think there will be stakes.
Yeah.
I'm sure all the people that disappeared in Avengers Infinity War are never going to come back. That's I'm betting it now. I wish we could make this part of the summer movie wager. Black Panther is never coming back, guys. No, I'm just joking. I don't think that's the case. But we'll see. Avengers Endgame, really psyched about that. And check out Patrick Willems' video essays on the topic.
I will check that out because I agree with him.
It's like an hour. It's like an hour long, but it's well worth the time. So
it's another hour long I have to spend with the Avengers people when I am already running the 3 hours with this movie. But
I think that's a great attitude, Devindra.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay. So, Devindra, what have you been watching this week?
Oh, a couple things. Not Avengers. No more Marvel.
You know, the only reason why your attitude on Avengers is tolerable is because when we review Avengers Endgame, Jeff Kanata's going to be here, and you just know that it's going to be the best film he's seen in his entire life, right?
Oh yeah.
So
Jeff
I
Kanata
think
will
it's
be
nice.
phoning it in from the afterlife because the movie will have struck him dead. Like it is. It is. I don't know how he's gonna deal with that movie.
I think it's going to be, it will be like the great difference of yin and yang, and I'll probably be somewhere in the middle. So,
I mean, I hope the movie is good. That's all. It's just I'm not looking forward to this whole hype cycle. I'm not looking forward to like a lot of this anticipation leading up to it. I just want to get it done. I want to watch this thing.
all right, I'm excited about it too. All right, Devindra, what have you been watching this week?
I saw High Life, the new Claire Denis film, which is I think unlike any of her other films. I believe it's her first English language film. Stars, people, big name stars like Robert Pattinson and Juliette Binoche, who I think has also been in some of her other stuff. It's a very strange, surreal sort of take on a sci-fi movie. It's ostensibly about a group of, prisoners who were sentenced to death, who were put on a spaceship headed towards a black hole. And that's the deal they made. To help with science. There will be some experiments done on them, and also just to like study them and I guess see what's going to happen. It's not really a film about plot. I think that's true of a lot of Denis' films, but it's really interesting. I think her imagery is always pretty evocative. I haven't really kept up with a lot of her work, but I do remember like I had seen something of hers back in college, and it kind of stuck with me. It feels like, if Sunshine, Danny Boyle's Sunshine, is a movie about like humanity facing the end of the world, and we have to band together and do this thing and save the world. And it ends kind of on a happy note. This movie feels like the follow-up to that, where, humanity is just fucked. And how do we kind of survive as a society in the face of absolute desolation? Basically in the face of a black hole, like how do you rebuild society? I think that aspect of it is kind of fascinating. It is certainly a weird movie, like a lot of her things, from what I hear. There are things I'd want to mention here that feel like they're spoilers, but I've seen them mentioned in other reviews, so I don't know. Let me just say this is a Claire Denis space movie starring Juliette Binoche, where there is a thing called the fuck box, and it is a prominent thing in the movie. It is exactly what it sounds like, and I'll leave it at that. Like this movie is exploring, I think, a lot of ideas around morality and sexuality, and society on the edge of civilization. If there's no law, if there's no rules, how do you exist as humans? I found it fascinating and beautiful, and there's a lot of great stuff in this film. I can't wait to watch it again. I will say, don't go in expecting it to be a typical sci-fi movie, because it's certainly not that.
All right, well, that's High Life, and I've actually heard great things about it. I've seen the screenshots from the trailer, and it looks amazing. So I'm looking forward to checking it out. Also, you got to give it to Robert Pattinson. I mean, the dude just after he did the Twilight franchise, he could probably have converted that equity into
definitely
something much more lucrative than what he's doing with his career right now.
Both him and Kristen Stewart are doing great indie films, and they're great actors.
They're choosing these smaller indie films, right? That have probably very limited financial upside, but they're interesting.
They probably also don't need to work again for the rest of their lives, so they're free to do this.
Yeah. They get to do it. Yeah. So. All right, and so that's High Life, and it's playing in limited release right now. I'm looking forward to checking it out. It's actually playing in Seattle. Devindra, you've been watching some stuff on HBO as well, right?
Lots of HBO stuff. It is the whole new season of HBO. So we have Game of Thrones is back, and I guess, Dave, I'm not sure how much you're willing to say about this outside of your Game of Thrones podcast, but I liked, I liked the premiere. It feels like characters are actually in the same place for once. That feels like an improvement for a series where people have always been continents apart. So there's a lot of this fan serviceness happening, where you're just happy to see people greet each other because they said you haven't seen each other since season 1 or something. So I'm digging that. And I think the political intrigue that they're building up is really interesting too. I just hope, my worry is that they are so limited in terms of episodes for the season. It's 7 or 8, right? Where
6 episodes.
Oh man, 6. But some are going to be extra long.
Yeah.
I'm just worried, like, do they have enough time to really wrap this thing up? Well, I have noticed in the later seasons where it feels like the show is just getting to be a spectacle kind of mess. Like, it is more about the spectacle than it is characters talking to each other, which is something it used to do in the early seasons, and I really enjoyed. I'd recently rewatched the pilot, and just the first scene of the series of like that one soldier going into the north and like being confronted by a White Walker. It just feels so like I don't know, just so like deliberate, and so it takes its time to really get to where it's going. Whereas now, I think between last season and probably this one, it feels like the series is just trying to race itself to the end. I hope there's time. I hope like it takes time to really devote, give these characters their due. I don't want it to be sort of like a Marvel situation where we're just like racing to kind of finish up these storylines.
Well, I have some bad news, Devindra. The show we fell in love with in season 1 is basically gone. You know?
Yeah, it's gone.
It's gone forever. It's not coming back. But I thought the season premiere was solid, like pretty good. You know, I'd give it like a B+. Definitely some stuff was very rushed. The Theon stuff was very rushed, right? As an example. But as with you, I loved how we get to see these characters reunite, and I mean, 8 years, you know, 8 to 9 years, right? Of like just characters who haven't seen each other since season 1, finally getting to see each other again, and all that character development, all those character development chickens coming home to roost. It's a beautiful thing. So I'm a fan so far, and very excited for the season to come. So curious to see how they're going to end a franchise that is really like in its nature kind of unendable, right? Like it's very like I don't know how they're going to end it in a satisfying way. So anyway,
there's like a prequel series too that they're setting up or something, right?
Yeah, there's prequels, but those are like years away. You know, like
it's a whole thing.
Who knows? Like we will have lived lifetimes between now and when that's like. Who knows if it'll even come out? Like,
that's true.
A lot could happen between now and then. So
I will say it is. I'm looking forward to what is supposedly the longest battle ever filmed, or something like that. Like that sounds fun.
Yeah,
it's gonna be a whole episode. This one battle. I'm down with that.
Okay, so you've been watching Game of Thrones on HBO, and you've also been watching Barry season 2, which I've been watching as well, right?
So good. So I think Barry is it is such a perfect show because it's it's a great center. It's a great way to like for Bill Hader to kind of show off what he does best, like his peculiar style of comedy. But I think it's also about so much more. It is really about these characters like trying to find themselves and define themselves, in a world that doesn't quite, where they don't really fit in. I will say it continues to be funny. NoHo Hank, great as always. I hope the series, never really loses what makes it special. So if that means we only get a few seasons, so be it. It is so perfect. I want to rewatch these episodes again and again.
It's actually arguably, I read this article after season 1 ended about how like it's so good that you actually kind of want it to end. In the sense that like you want it to go out on top, and that's one of the challenges I think is going to happen. This Barry season 2, Barry was recently renewed for season 3, right? So, and one of the challenges of Barry is this guy is constantly imperiling himself, right? Like, so you need to keep this character alive, and as time goes on, I'm curious like how plausible it's going to be that this guy is continuing to be alive, So I think that is the biggest challenge of the show. So that's Barry season 2. I'm really enjoying it so far, and I'm just hoping that they like are able to keep the premise under control, because season 1 was really perfect, I thought.
Yeah,
and
it is like it feels like a magic trick, or it feels like an acrobatic, sequence you're watching. It's like they're balancing a sword on their tongue, and they're like on a unicycle. And can they keep this up?
Yeah,
I don't know, but I really enjoy watching the story right now. There's that. So watch Barry, everybody, if you haven't so far. There's also one other thing I want to mention, Dave. There's time. I saw Guava Island, the new Donald Glover thing, which is, I believe, an Amazon short. It's kind of like a short film because it's only like an hour long.
It's an hour long. It's streaming on Prime Video right now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's streaming on Prime Video. This stars Donald Glover, written by Donald Glover and his brother, I believe. Also co-stars Rihanna and Letitia Wright. It is sort of like it is a beautiful Caribbean fairy tale in a way. It's also kind of a musical because there are a couple like video sequences in there. It reminds me of like when groups would just like, even like Michael Jackson, they would like make long things that are basically like long music videos. It is beautiful. It features the West Indies, wonderfully. It's filled with color and sound. I just loved it completely. As somebody who's actually, from the West Indies, I love seeing this representation there too. Like, just this is the sort of thing I don't really think we're seeing much on TV or in film screens. I would love for Caribbean cinema to become more of a thing. And this is, it's a good way to showcase that environment and kind of the music and the people down there. And have to say, this thing also just looks beautiful too. It's directed by Hiro Murai, who's done most of Atlanta for Donald Glover, and also has directed some of the best Barry episodes. And it's shot in 4:3. It looks like it's shot on vintage film too. Like, it has a great 70s look to it. You can see the grain of the film. The colors just feel a little extra saturated in the way that 70s movies kind of were. Just has a great sense of place and being. So yeah, I enjoyed watching it. Just check it out, especially if you like the artistic leaps that Donald Glover is taking. This thing is so different than Atlanta, but at the same time, it feels completely aligned with everything he's doing. So definitely check it out. It's a ton of fun.
That's Guava Island. It's streaming right now on Prime Video. So I want to mention a couple things that I've been watching as well. I do want to give a programming note, by the way. So we mentioned that Jeff Kanata's not here today. I have a feeling that we're entering a time in the Slash Filmcast where the month of May in particular, there's going to be probably some interesting configurations of the Slash Filmcast.
Yeah.
So just like people should be aware. And in fact, I have a feeling Jeff Kanata is probably going to appear in this episode in the form of an ad. Is my guess.
Boy.
Is what's going to happen. I think that might happen, but if it doesn't, then this will just be completely random. So just want to mention that, like, hey, we're gonna have some interesting guests, but sometimes it'll be Devindra and Jeff, and sometimes it'll be me and Jeff, and me and Devindra, and so on and so forth. Because May is like a pretty busy month for all of us, so just something to be aware of as we head into the summer movie months. I'll mention a couple things real quick. I had a chance to see You're the Worst. I marathoned You're the Worst. The final season on FX.
Nice.
Yeah. Have you finished the show?
I haven't finished. I'm about like halfway through the final season. It's good. Still great.
It's a great show, and it's a show that really helped me. It's weird to say it this way, but it's a show that
helped you embrace your terribleness. Is that what you're saying?
So the characters in You're the Worst are in fact terrible people, right? As the title implies. And they're essentially caricatures of terrible people, right? It's like many of them
entitled millennials,
right.
Working these jobs where they're not really working that much.
Many of them have almost no redeeming qualities.
Yeah,
but it's clear that they're exaggerated versions of people, right? So it's not like these people actually exist in the real world, or if they do, they're very rare. But I think the show holds up a mirror to its audience and invites them to wonder what are the maladaptive ways that you approach relationships, right? What are the ways you approach relationships that are really unhealthy? What are the unhealthy ways of thinking you have? And it kind of invites you to see those aspects of your psyche play out on screen in this kind of sitcom style environment. Now, of course, the show is actually very beautiful. It's a single camera show. Every episode's half an hour, and I'm not doing a very good job of selling how funny it is. It's very amusing, but I liked how it explored modern relationships in a way that was very brutally honest, smart, witty, and just very funny. So it recently concluded its final season. So the series finale recently aired. And I'm not going to say anything about the final episode other than to say that it is one of the shows that sticks the landing. It is a show where the final episode is perfect, right?
That's great.
That's very rare to see, especially for a show that's 5 seasons long. But they did it, and it really wrecked me. that final episode. So
Oh boy,
I would really the whole show I think is available on Hulu and FX now. Unfortunately, there's no Blu-ray. I'm actually pretty upset about that because it's one of the few TV shows that I would feel very good about like buying the whole series on Blu-ray and owning it.
Yeah, there's one episode in the season that I've seen like where they go to like this summer house, somebody's like mansion in LA, and it's shot in like a classical like European highfalutin film type thing. Like it's just shot very differently than the rest of the series, but it looks amazing. Yeah,
the whole series looks amazing. So anyway, I really love You're the Worst.
Good stuff.
I'd recommend
Have you
check
seen
it
the
out,
rest of Catastrophe, by the way, Dave?
I have seen it. I'm a big fan of that show.
It's all good.
Streaming on Prime Video.
Yeah, I know.
So that's what I've been watching. You're the Worst on FX and Hulu. I think it's on Hulu. And you can also buy it on video on demand. I also had a chance to see the new Twilight Zone. I saw the first 3 episodes of Twilight Zone, and I think it's great. And I think it uses the sci-fi and these kind of interesting premises to explore, to do social commentary, right? Which is really great. Like the most recent episode called Replay uses the concept of a camcorder that can rewind time to portray the fraught relationship between African Americans and police in the United States.
Yes.
And I thought it was just very smart and really well done. And love the first 2 episodes as well. One of which is about Kumail Nanjiani as a comedian. One of which is about Adam Scott as a true crime podcast obsessed nutso.
The podcast stuff is hilarious. Although it's also a remake of the famous Shatner episode too, with
Terror at 20,000 feet. Is that what it's called?
Yep.
Terror at 20,000 feet. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So I'm really loving this show. Oh, Nightmare at 20,000 feet. Sorry, is what the name of that episode is.
So loving that is a strong word, Dave. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say I think Replay is a great episode. That is actually up there among like showing what the Twilight Zone
is
can
in
do.
the pantheon of Twilight Zone. Yeah.
I did not. The first episode felt like weak sauce to me.
Really?
Like,
the comedian episode?
Like it didn't really amount to much. It did feel like one of those things where, the Twilight Zone universe is just like fucking with this one guy for no apparent reason other than to be like, haha, be careful what you wished for. The second one.
Well, hold on. Before we move on, like I just gotta say, I disagree completely. Like I think that one thing that episode illustrates really well is the idea that like once you create art, or once you create art that is derived from your own life and you set it free into the world, it kind of in some really potent way no longer belongs to you. And I think that's a powerful concept and rendered beautifully in the episode.
I love the concept. I don't I don't think that there's a lot going on with that episode. Like the thing is like, also coming into the series right after seeing Us and seeing like Jordan Peele attached to it, like I don't feel like it's up to the same level that we're expecting, because he's not writing these episodes. He's narrating, he's being the Rod Serling stand-in.
And doing so very, very ably, in my opinion.
I think he's great. He's great as the narrator. The second episode was certainly better than the first, just to see Adam Scott freaking out on the plane. I also think it's kind of the setting there is kind of funny too, because I think a lot of media today, there are fears around Middle Eastern looking people on planes, and certainly a lot of stories today are focused on like how people are afraid of that, whereas that episode was about a white guy freaking out on a Middle Eastern airline. I found it kind of hilarious. But yeah, this rewind, I think it does so much more, the last episode at least.
Replay, I think,
Replay,
but the Twilight Zone. So I think it's CBS All Access is like slowly kind of building its bona fides as like a really like kind of must subscribe to for me.
For you. Wait,
CBS
are you
All
watching
Access,
Star Trek Discovery?
I haven't been. I've heard it's great though, so that's the thing I need to get into. But I've heard like,
did you subscribe to All Access for the Twilight Zone, Dave?
I did.
Come on. I've been talking about the Good Fight.
Between the Good Fight and Star Trek and the Twilight Zone, and then like future Star Trek series, I think it's like really gonna just like that's gonna really grab my attention, So
it is certainly like once these seasons end, I think it's gonna be a great bingeable deal for a lot of people. I will also say like I don't know if this show is worth subscribing to All Access for. The Good Fight. The Good Fight continues to be like the single best, I think, response to the Trump administration and to politics today. Like it is amazing. And I think you'd love Star Trek, Dave. Let me know when you start watching that.
I will check it out. And finally, I saw Afterlife, the new Ricky Gervais series on Netflix. I think Jeff talked about this last week, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I think he really liked it. I recall him like enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right about that? Yeah. I mean, I think it's solid. But it is also another 6-part British series where Ricky Gervais plays a raging asshole who is slowly redeemed over the course of 6 episodes, and then in doing so also kind of falls in love with Ashley Jensen.
Right? Oh, okay, great.
Which, if that sounds like the exact plot of Extras, that's because it is. So it's very similar in some ways, but I do think that what's interesting about Afterlife, I find an interesting part of Ricky Gervais's works is that he is such a raging asshole in like his most recent comedy specials, for instance. Humanity, his most recent comedy, he comes across as a very needy asshole. And like that's part of his persona, and he'll say like, "Oh, that's because I'm trying to be," but that doesn't mean I need to enjoy it. Whereas like in Afterlife, it's a very, very hopeful, humanistic message. It's very like gentle, hopeful, kind, like positive and optimistic. It resembles nothing like the character that he plays in his stand-up special for Netflix, Humanity.
This is what I told Jeff, by the way, is that I don't know if I can't accept this art from you, Ricky Gervais, because it is like the complete opposite of how you are in your specials, but also like just real life. Just seeing how this guy like responds to situations in real life too. Like I cannot trust this art. It feels like somebody trying to, play act to be human and how to empathize. I think
well, in any case, I think your relationship to Ricky Gervais is really going to inform how much you enjoy Afterlife. I thought it was a decent entry. I didn't actually think it was. I don't think it's as good as The Office. I don't think it's as good as Extras. But there is some funny stuff in here, and it is ultimately hopeful and positive, and I think we do need more of that in our lives. So that's Afterlife, and it's 6 episodes, 30 minutes each. There is going to be a second season, and it's on Netflix right now. So that's what I've been watching this week.
Cool.
Before we get into the review portion of the podcast, we got to thank all the people who donated to the /Filmcast this week. Big thanks to Matthias Bilishu and Sarorialist, as well as James Thomas for subscribing at the rate of $2 per month. Big thanks also to Eric Pratt and Tish Fitness, gave a very generous donation to us this week. If you want to support what we do here on the podcast, you can go to paypal.me/filmcast. That's paypal.me/filmcast. Or go to /film.com, click on the /filmcast tab, use the PayPal links on the side of the page. And you can donate to the show. Help us to defray the cost of putting it on, seeing movies. We'd really appreciate it. Of course, you should never donate if it in any way causes you hardship. But if it is non-impactful for you to donate to us, we always appreciate people throwing money our way. Thanks so much. Let's get on to our review of Pet Sematary.